first Olmsted experience was growing up in Buffalo. So it goes back a long way. And then my professional work started in Prospect Park in 1983. So that's a pretty long run in Olmsted landscapes. So one of the issues here is, how do we keep them vital for contemporary use? How do we respond to all of the many aspects of contemporary life and the challenges that we face in a way that integrates the history and addresses the importance of these rare and important places? So let me just start with a little background. This is the definition of historic designed landscapes that the Park Service uses. So this is from Park Service documents, and it's basically a landscape consciously designed or laid out by a landscape architect, master gardener, etc., in a recognized style or tradition, and that the aesthetic values play a significant role. Examples include parks, campuses, estates, and so forth, the many works of the Olmsted firm across 90-some years. In addition, they define historic sites, vernacular landscapes, and ethnographic landscapes. And we know that some of our parks have other layers of importance that are worthy of understanding and representing and telling a more diverse story. The image here is from Planting Fields. It's the Carshalton Gates. It's an Olmsted Brothers designed sequence with William Robertson Co., who's the owner of the Co. estate, now Planting Fields. And it's important to recognize that designers have a style. And interestingly, in studying the Olmsted landscapes, that style is predictable and consistent across time through different principles and through different years and places. So while places are unique, the application of the style can be consistent. So also I wanted to indicate sometimes we are not clear about sort of where we are in a process. And I know this is not a linear process, but essentially in more accessible language, the first thing we need to do is learn from the past and understand the place we have. The second is to know where you are now and inventory and document the existing conditions. Then there's a piece that escapes a lot of people. It's understanding continuity and change. What remains? What was historic? What's the evolution? And then identifying the character and the features that actually do remain. Because the rules in preservation say our job is to preserve what we inherit. And oftentimes we think that means we're supposed to put it back to what it was at some earlier time, but that is not our brief. Our brief is to respect what we have, which is very different from putting it back to what it was at an earlier time, which is often not possible, infeasible financially, not appropriate for the evolution of the place. So this understanding of continuity and change, we always use the word continuity as well as change, because even in radically altered landscapes, you can see the earlier imprints if you look carefully and you know what you're looking for. So then the next step is really to frame where you're going. And in the world of landscape preservation, we often call that a cultural landscape report. What it is there in the parentheses, historically informed master plan. So when you do a scope for a master plan, what normally people understand is you go from today into the future. The cultural landscape report deeply understands the past in order to reconcile the past with where we are today and bring it forward into the future. And then there are other components. You can define your management, understand what the plan is, what the skills, the people, and the steps are. and guide that with your mission and vision. You also, as any kind of site manager, need to frame team needs. And then there's another directive from the federal level that says, keep track of what you do. Essentially, when you intervene, have a record so that we know what that change was all about. This is a hand-colored image by either Maddie Hewitt Edwards or Frances Benjamin Johnson, two female photographers that did some excellent photography at planting fields. This is Olmsted vintage, Olmsted co-vintage. So what is the stuff we're dealing with? I mean, if we look at the complexity today, there's a whole bunch of issues in any public landscape. Maybe different ones for private landscapes, but really there's a huge realm. Climate change, Black Lives Matter, inclusion, resilience. How do you work with volunteers? What's the issue with sustainability? We have, although most of you may know, some of you may not, the United Nations has the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the 2030 worldwide agenda. And in our work for planting fields and in a number of our contracts, we are always citing those and saying, how do we act locally and align with global goals? So a number of these touch on those global goals. So let me talk for a minute about what we focus on in order to deal with that complexity. The issue really is, what is the Olmsted character? What have we inherited? How do we preserve it? And are there opportunities for what the Park Service calls rehabilitation? Now, that may sound to you like going to the Betty Ford Center and taking care of your health and well-being, but the idea is basically conceptually respect what you inherit while you suit contemporary and future use. So if you're respecting and then you're suiting new uses, that's your big issue. So in looking at Olmsted landscapes over some 4 decades, there are character defining features that are repeated. So how do they deal with natural systems and hydrology? They look at the genus loci, they design for a unique place. They respect those natural systems and sometimes make transformational change to them. Like at Prospect Park, a big lake was made with the water. In terms of land use and patterns, they shape for function and choreography. So there's always multiple issues being addressed. It's the aesthetics, the movement through space, and what the function is. Dee Dee has asked if you can have this, and I'm happy to share the PDF with anybody. So you don't have to write all this down. You'll have the page. In terms of spatial organization, there is a real definition of space. It's always curvilinear and it's sequential. For visual relationships, they vary from broad and long to focused and tightly defined. And those can be an issue in contemporary world because of issues of visual connectivity and the feeling of personal safety. So first, understanding the visual relationships then helps you reorganize them if needed in order to reinforce the feeling of your own personal safety. And in fact, when crime happens in parks, which it does, making people more aware of their surroundings so they don't become victims of crimes. So topography and the ground plane, there are Olmsted grading principles, particularly using OG curves, which are convex concave relationships. And there are clear ways in which the Olmsted grading and alignments move through space on circulation systems. In vegetation, the forms are curvilinear, amoebic shapes and have massing heights that are harmonious. Again, we have worked in several parks to lower the heights of some elements, have the trees high, have the shrub masses lower or infrequent, so that barriers are not created to visibility. Circulation systems, Olmsted curves are incredible. There's never a flat place. The standard engineering is to do a flat line and an arc. Olmsted curves are one arc connecting to the next arc, connecting to the next arc, connecting to the next arc. And those radii on all those curves are different. So you could have your first arc at 200-foot radius, the next one at 30-foot radius going in the opposite direction, and then continuing from there. They are tricky to lay out, and engineers, I don't think by training can do it, but those who maybe have had a lot of experience could do so. As my friend Joanne Beck, who's a landscape architect, understands. Water, rivers, wetlands, fountains, they're in Olmsted designs. They are visually important and they are accessible. So at the parks in Louisville, we just talked about Chickasaw a minute ago, which was a black park. I contributed to a cultural landscape report on that, I don't know, 15 years ago. There was a beach. So when you're looking at a beach and you're looking at a river, oftentimes there's a big grade change. You're looking at finding a way to access that. And with contemporary needs for 5%, we are always working on accessibility in the case of a river here, but in the case of moving through the landscape in general. So structures, walls and bridges are functional and aesthetic. As you know, in Central Park, the bridges are forming separations of ways so that you have less conflict in circulation. Now, there are ways to separate routes of movement if bicycles and pedestrians are not intended to conflict, using those principles and not necessarily building bridges. Buildings need to be considered in cultural landscape as mass and scale and often detail and style. So in the Olmsted design, they're functional, aesthetic, and integrated. Sometimes the Olmsted firm has a hand in the building design. Sometimes they're reacting to the design that is built, that is designed by others. And then there are small scale furnishings. And in the records of the firm, you find an integration and a series of standards. So the idea is that they often worked with a city and organized their standards so that they worked for places. And then additionally, I would say we're looking at Olmsted character as a unified amalgam, the sum of the parts. And for experience, you need to also consider what's the atmospheric qualities, the sounds, the scents, the light, the bird song, hearing, laughter, and the enjoyment of the place that is ephemeral and intangible. So that's kind of the big detail. I'm going to show you some projects and some images that express those ideas. And here, this is a great early view of the Capitol, 1901. Olmsted Senior's perhaps most enduring project. He was on site and clerk of the works from 1874 to 1891. And it's not very well understood, but Olmsted actually is, and his team is the designer of these terraces. They're not designed by the architects of the building. And the whole idea here is the notion of support and dominance and subservience. So the Capitol sits on a piece of land, as you can see from this view here. This is our 1894 period plan, Olmsted complete. This is a big building, and there's not much space to negotiate the grades on the side. So this is why the terraces were built, and the flow of the ground was shaped to the west to drop away from the Capitol, so the Capitol stood in its prominence. So that's the idea of focus, dominance, and support. At Prospect Park, and this is an 1871 version of the master plan there, there are spatial extension ideas, the Long Meadow and the lake in particular, that give you a sense of freedom in a city. At Planting Fields, this is a detail underway of work of the reshaping of the lawn near Coe Hall for the kind of indefinite edge that the Olmsted firm most favored. The construct here is creating the space in a way that you get a sense of spatial extension. So if you look at this plan above, you see this kind of wiggly edge. You're always seeing a foreground, a midground, and a background, and it makes the space feel larger. At Oldfields, the Olmsted brothers, Percival, Gallagher, dropped the grade of the road, which sits right here. And with which, this is the road here, and when you look here at the lawn, you don't see it. So why is that? The point is to elevate the green plane and have the green be what you see. And then the secondary loop right here also drops into the grade for little presence. It's not completely invisible, but little presence. At a smaller scale, this is a vista south of the house in the azalea garden and this walkway. And the Olmsted firm added to the main path these secondary paths and then planted it in such a way that you could walk down this path and not see the other path. So another way of extending space is the choreography of movement, how you're able to move through this garden and feel that it is larger than it actually is.
Have a great trip.
Oh, wait, you were going?
At Jackson Park, the historic character is about the 1895 post-World Columbian Exposition, and where the firm was asked to come back and redo the park and make it into a park. This is that plan, and this is the planting plan, and you see the kinds of shapes that I was talking about, these planting shapes, these amoeba-like edge relationships. And this is a 1930s view of how that lagoon looked. So we had a really interesting project where the funding was all nature. And the State Historic Preservation Office pushed back and said, this is a landmark. You can't just do a green wash across this landscape. It has to align with the original Olmsted design. So the idea here is, how do you blend ecological restoration, which is what the funding was for, with historic preservation, social inclusion, to create an integrated design? We started this, I'm pretty sure, in 2014. It was a very interesting project because it had to be finished in 4 months because the Army Corps had done the preliminary work and then this conflict with the SHPO, and there was this very fast timeline. So we created this very detailed planting plan, worked with 74 distinct plant communities, and developed a shared language with the ecologists using their native Chicago 500 radius plants in order to really clearly articulate the Olmsted design using the shapes and the organization of that plan I showed in the frame before. So we informed it all with the Olmsted design. For example, 2 important questions. The Olmsted firm used a lot of shrubs. We can't afford them and you can't burn them. And you've told us that you're going to manage this landscape with controlled burns. What do? So we said to the ecologists, give us a grouping of these native plants that's fairly low, kind of 3 foot max, maybe 2 foot, but has a round form. We don't want those spiky grasses in this group. We need round forms so that at least at one point in the year when these plants have grown up and through the fall until they color and drop down for the year, we have this rounded, soft landscape form as if it were shrubs, and we keep it below eye level. So that was a really interesting dialogue. The second part of the dialogue was, what do we do about the lawn? Lots of mown lawn. This, unfortunately, a truncated lagoon. We were able to slightly extend it because there was infrastructure lines running under it and reshape it. But this is a low native composition that's not more than knee high. So that's one answer. Another answer is to do sedge, and we did use Pennsylvania sedge. So how do you get an Olmsted-designed lawn without the ecologic vacant, not biodiverse turf? It's a very interesting question. You also have to reflect on the fact that the lawns in Olmsted parks, in particular in the 19th century, were swards, which were rough. So they were much rougher than we're accustomed to seeing. So
when you say that, tell me more what you mean by swords and
SWARDS, swards. They were like not trees, not shrubs. They were low, ground plane, mixed species usually, but not high and not full of woody plants. So they were usually the things created from pasture. So if you had pasture animals out there, you would have a green sward, which is where the term green sward comes from.
Thank you.
So the next thing is sort of frame where you're going, and I'm using the example. Thank you, Gina Wooters and the team at Planting Fields for the opportunity to work with them. We did a detailed cultural landscape report, which historically based master plan for the 409-acre landscape. And then I want to ask the question, who would understand what we're trying to do? The Secretary of Interior calls for 4 preservation treatments. Here they are. When I ask this question, people usually say, when I say, okay, what is the most common treatment? People say restoration. I say, no, not at all. We're not putting it back to what it was, even though it may be well documented. What we're doing is preserve and rehabilitate. We're respecting what we inherit while we make it suit current use. So in this particular project, we used 5 codes, which is the way this overall plan is colored, for the areas where we could restore historic design elements, not necessarily the exact tree in the exact place, the feeling and the character of the place, where we could expand and manage horticultural collections, which this property is well known for and well respected for, the opportunities where we could uplift ecology and scenery, particularly in woodlands and in meadows, former pastures, in order to enlarge the mission. This isn't necessarily about the rich white men. This can be about nature. We can increase biodiversity and to enhance the visitor experience, learning, and services, as well as to be able to maintain the property better. So with these 5 vectors, then you see where are the focal areas for each of these to be played out within the landscape. So this doesn't mean it's exclusive. What it means is the dominant approach in that area is uplift ecology or work on the components of the historic design that are less evident today. We also aligned this work to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Health and well-being is goal 3. Safe and sustainable cities particularly says provide universal access to safe, inclusive, accessible, green, and public space. Climate action goal, work on making this landscape resilient so it can respond to the climate emergency. More biodiverse and healthy life on land, goal 15. And goal 17, work on all your partnerships. Your core partnership between the Planting Fields Foundation and the state of New York, but also all your other Long Island partners and all the other national and international partners. Understand that we all rise together. So this is just an example of an image that we use to talk about the ecology and field habitat. These are grassland birds that are threatened, and this property is on the Atlantic Flyway. So if they support grasslands more effectively, they can have support for these threatened birds. In this case, it's bobolinks and Savannah sparrows. And then we're working now on the entry drive renewal. This is the 1956 plan, and here's what we had in 2019. The continuity of the LA was lost. And the idea here is to renew all the way along and plant new trees. And this is what that will look like. So you note that the trees are spaced wider. There are a couple of issues here. Do you use the same plant when that plant has a lot of disease vectors and isn't going to make a lasting fix? The answer is no. So what's the character of an entry LA? The rhythm of consistent trees in 4 rows going down the drive. That's what you need to restore. So we're looking at 2 aspects of that. The piece of the road was enlarged up here to put in an entry booth, a ticketing booth. They now do ticketing down here at the pavilion at the new visitor parking lot. So the idea here is that we can get rid of that booth, make the entry drive uniform, and put back the rows of trees. What do we use for those trees? Well, first of all, let me talk about arcs. This is just an example from an engineering text about the circular arcs and the tangents and the transitions. So you see the difference with this image and that image. That's just a graphic illustration of what I was saying about Olmsted curves. But even here, they go from a tangent to a transition to a circular arc. In the Olmsted idiom, there would never be a flat tangent. So this is what we're looking at for the chinkapin oak over 45 years. And we gave the board and those interested at planting fields this chart to look at the carbon sequestration, the stormwater absorption, and the energy conservation of those trees over decades. So looking at their size over decades, how much carbon sequestration, and what's the total yield of carbon sequestration. So you're putting the improvement into the framework of how this works to address contemporary climate change and resilience. So we're planting the chinkapin oak in the foreground, and this is the 45-year view. Why are we using oaks? The white oak family has very few disease vectors at the moment. The beech trees are under multiple assaults. The newest beech leaf disease can kill a mature beech in a year. So we're trying to use a durable tree. I just saw a presentation on oaks, and the code they used was take 10 steps, which means back up 10 steps from your tree, because if you go close, you'll see all the insect nibbling on your leaves. If you back up 10 steps, you don't see it, but that tree supports literally hundreds, often thousands of small insects, and the oak is the keystone in ecology. And that's Doug Tallamy's research. So just to indicate to you, there is federal preservation guidance. I've tried to give it to you in a way that is more accessible. And what our generations inherit is a communal platform, and Olmsted landscapes are shared assets. So planetary rights is what I keep talking about, because we're talking about rights at all different levels, but we're often talking only about human rights within the human element. In a time when we have so many issues globally, we have to put it into a context of respect for the living earth. Bringing that forward, not centered on human rights, inclusive of human rights, but looking at all species. Thanks.
All right, Patricia, thank you very much for much food for thought. Now, this group tends not to be shy, so I am going to assume that there will be a few questions amongst us here to follow up. And I will be looking for, we'll start with Mary.
And remember, I've muted everyone, so you'll have to unmute yourself.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Hi, so I'm Mary Pelletier, and I'm in Hartford, Connecticut. And as you know, Olmsted was born and buried here, but here's minimal landscape in Hartford, of if any, from Olmsted Senior. But he did walk along the North Branch of the Park River and wrote a letter in 1871 to the Treasurer of Connecticut recommending conservation of the landscape by laying the riparian corridor, by laying out the roads in a way that would be away from the river. And he highlighted that in the letter. And so currently we're working to try to convince the powers that be to create a conserve and revive the landscape along the riparian corridor in honor of Olmsted. And this is a engineering challenge. There's, sewage issues, there's drainage issues, but there are parts of and there's a lot parking lots and floodplains that need to be removed in order to restore the wetlands. Jacob Wiedemann did a drawing in 1870 something or other, proposing that there be
Mary, you don't have to tell me the history of Hartford. I did 30 years ago, I did a master plan for 32 parks in Hartford, and we did the Old North Cemetery cultural landscape.
Oh, good. So yeah, how would you, given that how would you go about securing a design team that could adequately create a 21st century landscape in a landscape that was never, completed, but an idea that Olmsted had?
Yeah, there are good conceptual ideas that come from the past that are worthy of thinking through and figuring out for today. Let me suggest that it's not only about the design team. I've worked with 4 tool groups over the years. And what I would suggest is, number 1 is knowledge and planning. Number 2 is community engagement. Number 3 is regulation and law. And number 4 is finance. So you have 4 areas of work that have to be incorporated with this. And you're in the position of being a local advocate. So you got to understand that you need money, you need legislation or regulation, which means political will. You need community engagement so that the voice is strong enough to push for those things. And then you need a good plan. So often you say, let's start with the plan, but you need to understand that you've got these 4 large areas that have to be aligned in order to get things done. So that would be my quick answer.
So Patricia, we're working in Yerkes Observatory with the 1906 plan, and we've done actually what you recommended, because we got a lot of this from Dee Dee, on the preserve what we have and begin rehabilitating and, you know, not using invasives, et cetera. But the piece that we've really struggled with is the plans are so specific on what tree is where, but very unclear of what's between the trees. And you touched on that with your swords and some of the meadows and such. There are areas that are highly trafficked that we're going to keep in Kentucky bluegrass, but there are a lot of areas that we'd like to get away from Kentucky bluegrass. And that one picture of that you showed with the very short meadow, have you got any thoughts or guidance on places that we could go for research or ideas for the areas that we want to take out of bluegrass and get into something?
Sure. I mean, I think if you did a web search, you'd find a lot of meadows. The work we did in Jackson Park in Chicago is a good example. I think the sedge lawn is holding up very well in the area that we worked. And I think the idea really is to have the direction that is scaled. You know, okay, here we have trees, they offer shade, they offer quality of light. Here we have low ground plane. You may not want to, once you start to move over to transition to meadow, you may not want to save the Kentucky bluegrass. You might go with no mow fescue or other types of ground plane work. But remember, everything's about the soil.
Yep.
So if you haven't done soil tests, you don't understand your percolation rates, all of that is critical. We worked on the National Mall team. One of the things that we did as a team there, not me specifically, but James Urban and the soil experts, they put down a platform and a tent to see how long it took to kill the grass. What did it take in DC? 5 days. So it's all about the soil. We did, I think the total budget on the project was $42 million. That was before this crazy escalation in construction costs, but it was a 4-foot deep excavation for the humongous irrigation systems that had constantly been pierced by tent stakes. And then a soil layer, deep soil layer that was sandy loam. So the transition of the soil to sandy loam was critical. And then the whole grading of the mall so that the drainage up to the curb be gathered into cisterns, be cleansed, and be used for irrigation. We have a green national mall in a way that most people don't understand at all, but it's really all about the soil. Sarah had her hand up, so
Yeah.
Sarah's up next.
Hi, everyone. Question from Jamaica Plain, part of Boston, the Arborway, which is, you probably know, Parkway.
1984, leader of the project manager for the Emerald Necklace Master Plan. I know it well.
Great. So we're now in another planning process for how to deal with the linear park connections, multimodal, beyond the pond towards Franklin Park. And we have the dilemma that well, let me go back to your slide on circulation. It focused on the Olmsted character, focused on curves, triangles, separation of modes. But what would you do when the traffic volume is so high that a curved approach like roundabouts that were put in, although there are a lot of signals too, the current consultants in DCR are leaning towards signals just to make it clear when pedestrians and bicyclists can go, or even like the traffic volume. It's not great for motorists now either. It's a high crash area with the roundabouts. So wondering if you have any words of wisdom.
Well, let's just say that my professional license and that of the engineer is public health, safety, and welfare. So if we're not suiting public health, safety, and welfare, we're not doing our work appropriately. So we're always talking about that. So Sarah, I would back up and say, what are my big objectives? Am I trying to get multimodal? Am I trying to slow the traffic down? Am I trying to make sure the pedestrians are safe? Okay, so if you've got your list of objectives, then you say, okay, so how are you guys dealing with each one of these? What is the way that we can make the pedestrians the safest? What we've found is raised tables at intersections so that the pedestrian doesn't change grade. The pedestrian stays at the grade of the sidewalk and comes across the street. It's not like a speed bump. It's about 20 feet wide total with 2 angled edges and a raised table for the pedestrian. It slows the traffic. It keeps the pedestrian safe. So there's one little, detail that we've used. But multimodalism, back out of the traffic on the Arborway and see where are the major connectors. What's the relationship of the traffic flows in Boston? Has the T got enough money? Can enough people get on the T? You got to look big picture here. Is there a major corridor that could hold more traffic if you squeeze down the Arborway? If you gave some of the space away from cars and toward bikes and pedestrians? What are the ways to solve the problem if you've got clear objectives? So just an overview.
Thank you.
We do have a comment in the chat from Fenella, if you want to jump in.
Vanilla?
Sure.
Oh, you're muted.
Thanks, Vanilla. That's cute. Yeah, we did, when I first started my office, like 1987, 88, 89, 90, we worked on a series of little, I think 5 booklets for the Downing Park Master Plan, because the New York State Preservation League had this tiny bit of funding every year. So sequentially, so that's another lesson, you can make small steps and get somewhere. So Vanilla is saying it's still valid today. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, there are some new pressures. I know there's this huge issue with reburial of remains at Downing Park that is really a hot button for a lot of people. Downing Park is not well funded. The city of Newburgh has always been on the poorer side of the Hudson River. The question of how to resuscitate that park, I mean, it needs all 4 items: the political will or legislative mandates, the funding mandate, which is also part of the political will. But frankly, there is a ton of money out there right now. I mean, we're all going into huge debt, but there's a ton of money out there. So if you have the right grant proposal, you can find the money. And then good planning and community voice, which is what the Downing Park Alliance, the Downing Park nonprofit, whatever you're calling yourselves these days. Yeah, so maybe you need to, get a stronger voice so that you can push these other 3 agendas: the money, the law, and the plan. So yeah, I mean, any place needs a new look after 10 to 15, 20 years after any good planning effort. I mean, the first 3 things you do change your perspective.
I'd like to just jump in here for a second. I've been coming to these wonderful exchanges for as long as they've begun. I'm addicted to them. They're fantastic. Downing Park has a new team and a new energy, and they've changed their name from the Downing Park Planning Committee to the Downing Park Conservancy. and the new president is on board here. And also Chris Manzione, who is, I think, the treasurer. Julia Raskin is the new president, and she is bringing a lot of new, great energy here. And I said, and Joe Hull is on too. And I said to them all today, I said, if we all show up today, I think the Downing Park will be the most well-represented park on the exchange today. Anyway, I just want to give them a real good welcome. I'm very excited about the energy that they bring and enthusiasm. And this has been a wonderful presentation, Patricia. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Yep. Great. Welcome, Julia and Chris. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Great presentation.
We have an opportunity for one more question. Anybody want to jump in, or are we going to let Patricia have her Friday afternoon?
This is Jerry Wright on the
Jerry.
phone.
Okay.
Yes, I had trouble, but this has been absolutely terrific. So Patricia and everyone else, because this gets down to the heartbeat of what Olmsted was trying to do. And I could have many questions, but when you focused on the soil, Patricia, how about the warming, the overall warming all over the world, and the heat, and the temperatures in Boston today at 60 something?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is we all have to plant. Can't leave it to others. Everybody has to plant trees. And
Right.
of course, we're looking for shade. So urban heat island effect, the best thing we can do is plant trees. What do we have to do? Give the trees soil, give the trees space. So it's a very interesting process. I would point to the work that my respected colleagues at Reed Hildebrand did for Cambridge, where they looked at the issue of the urban forest for Cambridge, Massachusetts. I think it was an award-winning project maybe 4 years ago. What they found was very surprising. The surprising piece of it was that the tree loss on private property was greater than the tree loss on public property. And the private property owners were pointing the finger at the community. So what it did was turn that dialogue around. I don't know how it's resolved over time, but essentially all of us have to have trees, private property, public property. Warming, we all have to deal with the climate emergency every day in everything that we do. So this is one way to do it. Not that this is carbon free. I mean, doing this on Zoom is much better than having us all travel, but there is carbon still being used. So we better be working in every way we can toward net zero and drawdown. Drawdown.
Thank you.
If you haven't heard the term, drawdown is the point at which we are sequestering more carbon than we are releasing. So what we need
trees, plant trees, plant trees.
Well, drawdown is accessible in many ways. And if you look at the drawdown science, look at projectdrawdown.org on the web, you will find a lot of ways.
I'm sorry, I just have to weigh in here and say, it's not just about planting the cultivars, it's also about allowing those indigenous trees to grow from the soil, to grow from the seeds, to grow from those root systems. Those cultivars that get moved around are bringing diseases, they're bringing their own problems with them. And Olmsted parks, of all parks, the age of those parks allows us to have teachable moments where we can stop the mow and blow practices which use fossil fuels and allow those indigenous trees to come back, many of which the forests on those parks reemerge because they were left alone, in between the mow and blow, excess. So I just want to weigh in on that because that's a big controversy in Hartford right now. About tree management, and there's a lot of people, and there's a lot of emphasis on removal of trees, but not a lot of emphasis on just letting the growth grow and removing the invasive the shrubs and ground covers and replace, what was really lost was the shrubs and ground covers and vines that were native, because they got grazed out of existence. But the seeds from these old indigenous pre-European trees are coming back in our old parks.
Yeah, Mary, you have a big story there, and there's a lot more pieces, and I could talk with you about several of the points you made. But we often see, most frequently see in parks, a lack of young forest trees. Now that's for a number of reasons, and it isn't the mow and blow, because there isn't much mowing or blowing that's taking place in the woodlands in parks. But woodland health in parks is a complex problem, and it requires good thinking that's site specific to get to a solution.
Well, once again, I want to say thank you to Patricia for a fantastic presentation. And as I well knew, excellent questions from all of you as well. I hope you all are reading your chat box. Julia has provided us with an excellent Climate First tool from Natural Areas, New York City. So we will make certain that we have these resources for you. And as you've learned, this was recorded, and we will have the PowerPoint available to you as well, so that you can digest it at your leisure. Much to think about. So I want to just say thank you again to all of you for being with us today. We will see you next month, and have a great weekend. And thanks for all that you're doing.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Patricia.
Dee Dee.
Thank
Thank
you.
Wonderful.
Bye, everybody.